The wagon had been moving for 3 days when her father finally told her the truth. They were heading west, he said, to a new start. Her stepmother needed a fresh beginning, away from the judgmental eyes of Boston society. And there simply wasn't room in their new life for a 17-year-old daughter from his first marriage. "You'll stay with relatives in Denver," he said, not meeting her eyes. "It's all arranged." But when they arrived in Denver, there were no relatives. There was no arrangement. There was only a letter her father left with the hotel clerk, explaining that he had never actually had family in Denver, that he was leaving Catherine with enough money for 1 month's lodging, and that she would need to figure out her own future from this point forward. The money was gone within 6 weeks, consumed by room rental, food, and the basic necessities of survival. Catherine found work as a maid in a boarding house, but wages were barely enough to keep her fed, let alone housed. She was intelligent enough to understand that, without family connections or a husband to support her, she was looking at a future of perpetual poverty and exploitation. The Denver winter of 1888 was brutal. As November turned to December, Catherine's situation became desperate. She had been evicted from her boarding house room for being unable to pay rent, and she was sleeping in a stable at night, working wherever she could find day labor, and slowly starving. On a night when the temperature dropped below zero, Catherine sat huddled in the stable, certain that this was where she would die. She was 17 years old, abandoned by her father, rejected by every institution she had appealed to, and alone in a way that no person should be alone. She didn't expect rescue. She didn't expect anything anymore except cold and hunger, and the slow shutdown of her body as it succumbed to hypothermia. That's when the stranger found her. His name was Thomas Sinclair, and he was a rancher in his late 40s who had come to Denver for supplies and business matters. He had gotten drunk at a saloon, something he rarely did, and was wandering through town in the early morning hours, trying to clear his head before returning to his ranch. He found Catherine in the stable more by accident than design. He nearly tripped over her, and for a moment he thought she was dead. But when he checked for pulse and breath, he found both faint but present. Thomas had experienced enough frontier winters to know that this girl was minutes away from permanent death. Her lips were blue. Her skin was waxy and cold. Her breathing was barely perceptible. He made an instant decision that would change both their lives. He carried Catherine out of the stable and to his hotel room, where he began the careful process of bringing her core temperature back up. He built a fire. He wrapped her in every blanket he possessed. He sat with her through the night, monitoring her condition, uncertain if she would survive. By morning, Catherine's eyes fluttered open. She was alive. Over the next few days, as Catherine recovered enough to speak, Thomas learned her story: the abandoned daughter, the useless month's allowance, the refusal of every institution to help a young woman without family connections, the slow descent into homelessness and starvation. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of injustice so profound that it demanded action. "I can't leave you in Denver," he said simply. "The city will destroy you. You need safety, shelter, and a real future." "I have no money," Catherine replied, her voice hoarse. "No family, no prospects. There's nothing you can do for me that will change the fundamental reality. I'm alone and the world doesn't care." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would echo through the rest of Catherine's life. "Come to my ranch," he said. "I have a cabin on property, a small place where I store supplies and occasionally shelter guests. It's empty most of the time. I'll give it to you. You can live there. Work for me if you're capable. There's always work on a ranch. Or don't work. That's your choice. But you won't be abandoned and you won't be alone." Catherine stared at him. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be dangerous. I could rob you. I could." "You could," Thomas agreed. "But you won't. I've been around people long enough to recognize character. You have it. Despite everything the world has done to you, you haven't become bitter or cruel. That's rare. That's worth protecting." The cabin was small but solid, a one-room structure with a fireplace, a bed, a table, and a small storage area. It was warm. It was safe. It was everything Catherine had stopped believing existed. Thomas brought her supplies: food, blankets, oil for the lamp, wood for the fire, and most importantly, he brought her the knowledge that someone in the world thought she was worth saving. Catherine threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised Thomas. She helped with household operations at the main ranch house. She cooked and cleaned and organized. She took care of the horses. She did whatever needed to be done, always with the understanding that Thomas had given her an impossible gift, and she wanted to prove she deserved it. Over months, as Catherine's strength returned and her confidence rebuilt, something unexpected happened. She and Thomas began to have conversations that went beyond the practical. He asked her about books she'd read. He inquired about her thoughts on life, on the world, on her future. He treated her as a person whose opinions mattered. And Catherine, for the first time in her life, experienced genuine human connection with no expectation of exploitation attached. One spring evening, as they sat on the porch of the main ranch house watching the sunset, Thomas spoke words that terrified and thrilled Catherine in equal measure. "Catherine," he said, his voice careful and deliberate, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your answer doesn't change anything. You can remain in the cabin. You can continue working here. Your security is not contingent on your response." Catherine's heart began to race. She thought she knew what was coming. "I have come to love you," Thomas continued, "not out of obligation or gratitude for the situation I've placed you in, but because of who you are, your strength, your resilience, your capacity to move forward after being abandoned. I'm asking if you would consider marrying me, not to save you, because you're already saving yourself, but because I want to build a life with you." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. "You're asking me to be your wife?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm asking you to choose me," Thomas replied, "as I chose you that night in the stable." Their wedding took place at the ranch in the summer of 1889, attended by neighbors and ranch hands who had come to respect Catherine for her work ethic and her quiet strength. And as Catherine spoke her vows, she understood something profound. She had been abandoned by her biological father, but she had been claimed, truly claimed, by a man who had chosen to see her worth when she was at her most vulnerable. Over the following years, Catherine and Thomas built a life together that honored both the trauma of her past and the possibility of her future. Catherine had agency. She had choice. She had the knowledge that she was treasured, not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was. Thomas established legal documentation that made Catherine his heir, not just his wife, but his chosen successor. This was revolutionary for the time, a clear statement that his estate would go to the woman he had chosen, not to distant relatives or patriarchal inheritance laws. Catherine became known throughout Wyoming for her charitable work, particularly with young women who had been abandoned or rejected by their families. She established a home for these girls, providing them with shelter, employment, and most importantly, the message that society's rejection of them did not determine their value. Years later, when people asked Catherine about the moment Thomas had offered her the cabin, about the moment she had understood that she was worth saving, she spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from genuine transformation. "I was dying," Catherine would say simply. "Not just physically, though I was dying of cold and hunger. I was dying spiritually, emotionally, in every way that mattered. I had internalized my father's judgment that I was disposable, that I wasn't worth keeping, that my existence was more burden than blessing. When Thomas found me in that stable and brought me to warmth, he wasn't just saving my life. He was saying with his actions, 'You matter. Your life has value. I choose you.'" She would pause, emotion visible on her face. "The cabin wasn't just a structure," she would continue. "It was a sanctuary. It was proof that someone in the world believed I deserved safety and shelter and the chance to build a future. And that belief, that single person's refusal to accept society's judgment about my worth, that changed everything. It gave me permission to believe in myself. It showed me that abandonment isn't final, that rejection isn't truth, and that sometimes a stranger's love can heal the wound created by a father's abandonment." When Thomas died at 81, Catherine was at his side. They had been together for 43 years. 43 years of proving that love built on genuine recognition of worth could be stronger than any biological bond. At his funeral, Catherine spoke about the man who had found her dying in a stable and had chosen to see her as treasurable rather than disposable. She spoke about the cabin that had been her first real home. She spoke about how his decision to claim her had ultimately allowed her to help hundreds of other young women claim their own worth. "He gave me a cabin," Catherine said, her voice strong and clear. "A small, simple structure that became the foundation of everything I would become. But more than that, he gave me the belief that I was worth giving to. In this world, where women are constantly told that our value is determined by our usefulness to men, by our beauty, by our ability to bear children or manage households, he looked at a starving, abandoned girl and said, 'You're worth this.' Through his generosity, he taught me that worth is inherent. It's not earned. It's not purchased. It's simply there, waiting to be recognized by someone with eyes to see it." Catherine lived for another 12 years after Thomas's death. She spent those years continuing his legacy, taking in abandoned young women, providing them with shelter and employment, and most importantly, teaching them that being abandoned by one person doesn't determine their value in the eyes of the world or in the eyes of God. On her grave, simple words were inscribed: Catherine Sinclair. She was abandoned in winter. A stranger gave her a cabin. Through her life, she gave countless others a home. And in Wyoming, the Sinclair Foundation, established to provide shelter and support for abandoned young women, continued the legacy of a rancher who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply offering someone a place to be safe and a consistent message that they are worth saving.